good morning and good afternoon to my fellow colleagues, church and community leaders, and invited guests from across the United States. Thank you so much for joining me in our fourth dialogue in the Uncomfortable Conversation series. My name is Reverend Rebecca Simon Peter. I'm a spiritual and leadership coach. I am passionate about reconnecting faith leaders and spiritual people with their God-given powers to co-create miracles with the divine. For more than a decade, I have pastored local churches, and I've been pastor in an African-American congregation as well as white congregations within the United Methodist denomination. I've written several books over the years, most recently, Dream Like Jesus, Deepen Your Faith, and Bring the Impossible to Life. I am the founder of Creating a Culture of Renewal, which is a group coaching program for church leaders, and it's designed to empower people to reconnect their congregations with the communities, envisioning powerful miracles that bring new realities to life. So the Uncomfortable Conversation series was born out of the calls for racial justice in our country and around the globe, and the series was designed to engage folks like you and me in uncomfortable conversations to expose systemic racism, to empower us as leaders of faith communities to make a difference, and to engage in deep listening, heartfelt discussions so that we can expand our emotional intelligence and frankly expand our positive impact on the world around us to generate renewal in times like this when there's so much that's opening up, but at the same time there feel like so many forces that would keep us stuck or even moving backwards in time. So speaking of which, today we're going to be discussing racism, redlining, redistricting, and voting rights, the four very important R's, with two really special guests today. We have David Daley with us, best-selling author and senior fellow for Fair Vote, which is a nonpartisan champion of electoral reforms. David is widely recognized as one of the leading national authorities on voting rights, partisan gerrymandering, and his newest book is Unrigged: How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David, thank you so much for being here. Hold that book up. Let's take a look at that book.
Got it, absolutely. Here we go.
Yeah, Unrigged. Very good. That's actually your second book, is it not?
It is, yes.
Yeah. And do you have that first book there?
The first book has a title that I'm just going to do. Yes.
The first word is rat. Okay, got it. Thank you very much. Really, really pleased to have you here. I know you're going to contribute greatly to the conversation. We're also joined today by Professor Gilda Daniels, Assistant Professor at the University of Baltimore, School of Law, voting rights expert, former Deputy Chief in the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, Voting Section. We are so thrilled to have you. You have served in both the Clinton and Bush administrations, and Professor Daniels is the author of Uncounted. We have Unrigged and Uncounted: The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America. Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for being here with us today. I said it before, I'm going to say it again. This topic could not be more timely. We are less than 30 days away from the presidential election. We have a recent unpresidential debate under our belts, and a vice presidential debate now under our belts as well. And the outcomes and the processes of voting are very much on everybody's mind, especially as we've heard such disheartening information, disinformation, misinformation, and hard information about the administration and the United States Postal Service, one of our very basic conveyors of ballots being under attack. So let's start it right at the beginning if we can. Oh, and welcome to all our guests. Pardon me for not saying that sooner. Thank you so much for all of you being here. We're gonna have a really great conversation. I'm gonna invite you to put your comments in the chat window. We'll get to those in just the right moments to include your conversations, your comments, and your observations in the discussion here. So let's start at the beginning. Gilda, David, what is gerrymandering? What is voter suppression? Talk to us about that. How does it relate to racism? Let's start with you, Gilda, and then David, jump right in after that.
Thank you again for having me. I'm really happy to be here and speak with faith leaders across the country. It's a very big question in regards to what is gerrymandering, what is voter suppression. I'll take the what is voter suppression. I'll let David handle the what is gerrymandering, although we can both talk about all of those things. So in regards to what is voter suppression, it's a system that deters, thwarts, even in many ways prevents certain groups of people from freely, fairly, and in a non-discriminatory way to participate in the political process. As a country, we have historically, we are historic voter suppressors. From the outset of the founding of this country, the founding fathers decided that only white men who owned property could have the right to vote. And in fact, installed a type of second-class citizenship in the Constitution by saying that enslaved persons would only count as 3/5 of a person, while white persons would count as whole persons. And so from the outset, we decided that only certain people should be able to participate in the democratic process. And that has continued to evolve in our history, and at points where we could have made the decision to truly be a government where, to truly be a government of we the people, we decided to be a government of only some people. As opposed to all people. We had the passage of the Civil War amendments with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote, or certainly said that prevented discrimination based on race, but essentially gave the right to vote to African-American men. And so you had this newly enfranchised group that saw certainly voting as a duty, and they registered and they voted and they elected persons on the state, local, and federal levels. You had members of Congress. Mississippi elected 2 Black men to the United States Senate. We have not had 2 Black men from the South in the United States Senate. We've only, in the last 10 years, gotten 3 African Americans in the United States Senate. So from 1880 to 2020, we've had a net increase of 1 African American in the United States Senate. That is, let that sit for a little bit. And so you had this short, and then you only had this short period of Reconstruction, which was certainly less than 20 years, around 12 years actually. And then you had laws that were being passed that certainly essentially eliminated the right to vote for Black people. And those laws were poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and literacy tests, violence, economic terror. You vote, you could lose your job. You vote, you could lose your life. And certainly those kinds of methods continued certainly until the 1960s and the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which eliminated many of those methods and provided for federal employees to go to the South and actually register people where Southern registrars refused to do so. And you had federal employees who observed elections. So you had a system that was in place that prevented the participation of people of color. Now we don't have, bull counter in the courthouse door today, and you don't see the pictures of the dogs after the children like we did in the 1960s. But certainly today we have these voter suppressive measures that are just as effective. And certainly the laws that are being passed, we can look to Florida and their felon disenfranchisement law, where 1.4 million people do not have the right to vote. And you had the citizens of the state of Florida decide that that law should be changed, and they voted to restore the right to vote to more than 1 million people. And then it was the legislature that said, not so fast. I have a subtitle in the book that says, free at last, not so fast. And so that's essentially what they said to those persons who had gotten their right to vote restored. So you have these measures that are put in place, and that's a part of a larger system to suppress, prevent, deter, and thwart, and on large scale, certainly people of color from participating in the political process.
Wow. So you're telling us we started off, some people are full human beings. Some people are not full human beings. Finally, there is an amendment that says basically you can vote, you're a full human being. I don't know if those actually go together. And then as soon as that amendment is in place, voter suppression starts. New voter suppression starts.
Yes.
So,
Right, and those, you know, the laws, and they were very explicit in the 1900s. In the South, in order the southern states that had participated in the Confederacy, in order to return to the Union, had to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment, I'm sorry, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment is equal protection, and in the 15th Amendment says you cannot discriminate based on race with the right to vote. And in order to come back into the Union, states had to adopt those amendments. So what Southern segregationists did was said, oh, okay, we'll adopt those amendments, but we're also going to adopt new laws that would essentially erase the Black man at that point from the voter rolls and from participating. It was so effective that in places like Alabama, when I say it, was essentially the grandfather clause, which said, if your grandfather had the right to vote prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment, then you could have the right to vote. Which also, I was saying that in a group before, and somebody mentions like, oh, so some of the things that we say now, like getting grandfathered in,
yes, yeah.
is certainly attributed to the grandfather clause, right? And so it's like, maybe we shouldn't say that, right? So the racist roots of certainly, you know, the racist roots of our nomenclature and the racist roots of certainly the right to vote and how it was denied based on race. And so so they passed these grandfather clause, a poll tax, a literacy test, and other means to prevent the right to vote. And it was so effective that in places like Alabama, where more than 140,000 Black men had registered, and this is, you know, between the time of the passage of the 15th Amendment and then when these Southern segregationists were having these constitutional conventions in 1901 and certainly in the early 1900s. So in a less than 20-year period, like from 1890 to around 1906, you had about 140,000 Black men who were registered in Alabama in 1890. By 1906, that number had gotten to less than 50.
Oh my goodness.
Because of the poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clause, economic terror, felon disenfranchisement. Those are all the kinds of measures that were being used at the time. And I certainly make the argument that today the names may have changed, but the effect is the same.
Yeah.
That we're still finding, Dr. King called, all types of conniving ways to disenfranchise Black and brown people.
That's amazing. So that makes a President Obama and a Biden-Harris ticket all the more exceptional, given the amount of voter suppression that's been woven deep into our history. Professor Gilda Daniels, you have a ton of information to share with us. Everybody needs to read your book, clearly, so that we can get the fullness of that. Let's hear from David Daly at this moment. Talk to us about gerrymandering. How does all that fit in with what Gilda has shared with us?
That is difficult to follow and incredibly powerful and absolutely correct. And what I would say is we are still living with this in very real ways today. All of these Southern states had to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They had to ratify them as preconditions of reentering the Union. And then they systematically went about enshrining white supremacy into their state constitutions. And in many cases, in Alabama and Florida, we are very much still living with all of that right now. The kinds of Black codes, of felon disenfranchisement that was baked into the state constitutions
What's a black code? What's a black code?
Well, it all dates back to the Jim Crow era. You know, this all dates back to laws that were established, oftentimes felonies that were designed to ensnare Black Americans in the South, poor people. So curfews, or as the case in Florida, if you would steal an orange or a couple pieces of fruit, that would be a felony, and you would therefore lose your voting rights as a result of that. But you would see in Alabama, for example, Alabama used something called moral turpitude for years. If you committed a crime that moral turpitude was attached to it, it would cost you your voting rights. And then they would define moral turpitude based in many ways as to whether you were white or Black. The same crime, very different effects, and oftentimes, a very minor crime might come attached with moral turpitude, but something white collar would not. And so this is all a scheme to determine who does and who does not have voting rights. And in many of these states, it's with us right up to the current day.
Right.
These relics of the old South are not relics, and they're not old.
So all that mass incarceration feeds right into this.
Oh, the war on drugs in the 1970s,
On
the
drugs.
1980s, the imprisonment in the 1990s. Yes, I mean, absolutely. All of this is of a piece, and all of it is very much interconnected. Redistricting is one of these methods. It's one of these tools. It's a very powerful method, especially today, with the kind of technology that is available to map makers as they are drawing district lines. We vote in districts for our state legislature, for Congress. And anytime you vote in districts, where those lines go make a very big difference. And if you have the power to draw those lines, you have the power to make the rules. You have the power to pick and choose which voters are in which districts and which voters are in the other districts. You can trace this back to the very beginning of American history. Patrick Henry tries to gerrymander James Madison out of the very first Congress. It takes its name from Elbridge Gerry, the old governor of Massachusetts, who was a Democratic hyphen Republican back in the 1810s. They draw a state Senate map in the Boston area designed to keep the Federalists out of power. It works. The Federalists get many more votes in the 1812 Senate elections, and Gary's Democratic Republicans hold on to the chamber. Over the years, districting had become a real weapon of control. You are supposed to have districts that are of equal population. But over the years, that was not exactly the case. Across the South, across rural areas, you would have districts that were often wildly uneven sizes. And as a result, you would change the very nature of representation in those districts. So, if one person is representing 30,000 people and someone else in the next district has 750,000 people, your votes are wildly unequal in those districts. And that was the case. There's a series of landmark Supreme Court cases in the 1960s that come together and try to stabilize, and guarantee that a district is a district, and that population deviations are kept in line. So what I'm trying to say is that redistricting has always been a potent tool. It's always been with us. It has always been something that partisans have been able to do in order to try to keep partisan control, or or also racial control. The kinds of districts that were drawn in North Carolina for many, many years. Professor Daniels was talking about Mississippi. North Carolina goes from 1900 until 1992 without having an African-American elected to Congress there. So this has become a really serious problem. And what we have seen this decade is that the levels of partisan gerrymandering have been ratcheted up, turbocharged to brand new heights. We are unfortunately better at gerrymandering than we ever have been. A part of this is a very intentional plan. Republicans, after the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the Democratic supermajority in the US Senate, they took a look at the changing demographics of the nation and they said, well, let's try to come up with a path back to power. And what they recognized was that because we redraw all of these districts every 10 years after the census, after 2010, they were able to take another crack at these lines. So they focused on winning state legislatures across swing states. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, states we are still talking about now as being necessary to the White House and places where there's been a lot of voter suppression over the course of the last 10 years. They took control of those state legislatures. They used the technology that was available to draw themselves essentially unbeatable lines that have held throughout this entire decade. There's now more than 50 million Americans, almost 1 in 5 of us, that live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes in 2018. And the very first thing that these state legislatures do when they are gerrymandered into power is they go after voting rights. So you have seen voter ID bills and precinct closures and voter roll purchases and eliminations of days of early voting and additional barriers put in front of people before they can register to vote. You've seen all of the things that have happened as a result of trying to have absentee balloting in the middle of a pandemic and in various states, whether it's witness requirements or drop boxes or when your ballots are able to be postmarked. So all of this is often decided by state legislatures. These state legislatures are often so heavily gerrymandered that the party in control has actually won fewer votes. And again, all of this got even additionally turbocharged after the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder back in 2013 that took away some of the key pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act and really gutted that. And I'm sure we can get into more of all of this over the course of the next hour.
Oh my goodness. So, is the feeling that I'm left with. But there's a question that's come that I would like to pose, and let's start with Gilda on this. Why are states allowed to set these rules without federal oversight, or are they in fact setting them with federal oversight? You know, the giving of rights and then the taking away at the state level.
Well, the states, under the United States Constitution, the states have the ability to determine the qualifications of electors. That means they get to decide what the residency requirements are. Like, for example, there's states that say you have to be a resident for 30 days in this jurisdiction before you can register. There, and other requirements such as what do you need to bring to the polling place in order to vote, or as well as the hours of voter registration and who can register. Now they can determine these qualifications within the confines of the United States Constitution. Now the United States Constitution has a number of thou shalt nots, right? Thou shalt not discriminate based on race. Thou shalt not discriminate based on sex or gender. Thou shalt not discriminate based on age, right? You have to be 18 over. And it also says thou shalt not have a poll tax, right? Thou shalt. And so we have a lot of thou shalt not. So there is this discussion that's going on now as to whether or not we need an explicit right to vote in the United States Constitution, but that's a whole nother conversation. You asked, why don't we have federal oversight today? At one point we did, and until 2013 we did, and it was under the Voting Rights Act. we had Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is, so the Voting Rights Act has essentially 2 or 3 primary provisions. Section 2 is a nationwide prohibition against discrimination in voting. And the Section 5 had what was called covered jurisdictions. So certain jurisdictions, and when if you can overlay the Confederate states and the states that were considered covered jurisdictions in 2013, and they would be essentially the same places, along, but there are some others, you know, parts of some other states, like parts of California, parts of even cities in New York that were required under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act to submit all voting changes to either the United States Attorney General or the DC federal court. And when they made these submissions, they had to be what was called pre-cleared or approved by the US Attorney General. And these changes were anything from moving a polling place across the street to a congressional redistricting. And then when I was in the Department of Justice, and certainly I was in the Department of Justice for a number of years, and served as a deputy chief in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division voting section, where we reviewed these submissions. Yeah. And the department would get, I think on average, about 5,000 submissions a year.
Wow.
But those submissions accounted for about 10,000 changes, right? So because within each submission there were changes, like, you know, if you moved more than one polling place, those kinds of things. When we reviewed the submissions, we were reviewing them to determine whether or not Black and brown voters were put in a worse position. So was it retrogressive?
Yes.
So if it retrogressed, then the department would object. And the wonderful thing about Section 5 was that the jurisdictions could not implement the changes until they had received approval. So the legislature could vote and the governor could sign it, but they would have to send it to the U.S. Attorney General for him or her to make sure that it did not retrogress, that it was not retrogressive. Now, and if it was retrogressive, they would object, and that would mean that the state or the city or the county could not implement that change. Here's an example how it would have worked. For example, you might have heard last week that the governor of Texas made an order that counties in Texas could only have, wait for it, 1 drop box for these millions of vote by mail applications. He said the county, so think about it, a place like Houston. Wow. Houston is in Harris County. So it's one thing to say the city of Houston can only have 1 drop box.
Yeah.
The entire how big is Texas?
Crazy.
Now, Texas was a Section 5 covered jurisdiction up until, right, the passage of, after the Supreme Court decided the Shelby County decision that said that there were parts of the Voting Rights Act that was unconstitutional, outdated, right? So if we still had Section 5, the governor could have made that order, but would not have been able to implement it until the Department of Justice reviewed whether or not it was retrogressive and determined whether it was retrogressive for this kind. They would say, well, how many drop boxes have you had in the past? How many drop boxes we're in the middle of an election, and it's 30 days before an election, but you already had 100 drop boxes, 50 drop boxes, 10 drop boxes.
Yeah.
And would going from 10 drop boxes to 1 per county put voters of color in a worse position? Yes. The answer is yes.
Yes.
Right. And that would have been objected to, and they would not have been able to implement that change. But what we have left under the Voting Rights Act is Section 2, which is essentially it is a nationwide prohibition, but it's litigation. It takes longer. It costs more. So now advocacy groups, and I'm also litigation director at Advancement Project, which is a national civil rights organization. Groups like Advancement Project, NAACP, LDF, the most Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, would now, after the governor made that declaration, and now organizations have to go in and litigate this and try to litigate it 30 days before an election. And so instead of being proactive and preemptive, which was this oversight, this federal oversight that we once had prior to Shelby County, now we're being reactive. We have to be reactive because that oversight is missing. But one things you can do, the House has passed legislation more than 100 days ago saying restore these parts of the Voting Rights Act, and it's been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk for more than 100 days. So we need, that's a nonpartisan way of saying do your jobs.
Do your jobs.
At least give it have the committees send it. Let the committee have a discussion. But it has not even left his desk. So that's the only that's one of the ways we could get that type of oversight.
Okay.
Right now we don't have it.
So the name of the series is Uncomfortable Conversations. I'd say we're accomplishing the goal today. This is incredibly uncomfortable information and discouraging given the world we're in, because we don't have leadership that really wants to pull us together, but rather divide, lie, divide. So here we are, we're a group of faith-based leaders. We've got a separation of church and state in the United States. Many of us feel deeply this is an issue of justice. It aligns with our faith values. It aligns with our call to social justice, to have a freer, more just society that we live in. Many of us have given our lives and committed ourselves to justice as a faith commitment. What do people of faith do? How do we bring this into our congregations? How do we speak about this from the pulpit? Talk to us, both of you. What do you see as the connections for faith-based leaders?
I can, sure. So I am the daughter and granddaughter of Baptist preachers. I spent a fair amount of time in church and still do. In my book, in the introduction, I'm quoting scripture. And I started the book by something that my grandfather would say to us on those occasions when we would stay overnight with my maternal grandparents. He would wake us up by saying, "You're sleeping at a dangerous time." I did not know what that meant. I was just like, what are you talking about? How's it dangerous? I'm feeling safe. And so in the introduction of the book, I talk about how I didn't understand what he was saying at that time, but now certainly life has taught me that while we're being comfortable and sleep and resting and thinking that things are fine, other people are working towards our demise. And so that's the danger, right? And that we need to make sure that we're vigilant and always paying attention. The scripture that I quote in my introduction is 2 Timothy 3:5, which says, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. It has always perplexed me because I was like, how can you be like God and not have power? I'm trying to be godly, but there are things that I feel powerless to overcome. And so using that analogy towards our democracy, that we have a form of democracy, but it is not operating in its full power as long as it continues to suppress and prevent people from participating freely and fairly. How can faith leaders talk about social justice issues? Well, I do not see any separation between talking about Jesus and talking about liberation and talking about freedom. And he came to set the captives free. And I think it's also setting the captives free from discrimination. Free, so I don't see that there's any separation. Certainly under your 501c3 status, that you can't talk about it in a partisan way. but you can certainly talk about what the issues are, and I think certainly in the tradition of the African American church, it is certainly a part of, speaking about social justice issues, is something that is at the certainly in the past has been at the forefront. Now I'm a member of a mega church now, and I don't think we talk about social justice issues enough. But you can certainly talk. You can talk about. You can hold voter registration. You can have opportunities for people to register, right? Depending on the rules where you live and whether and having persons there who can register people to vote. So you can certainly register people to vote. You can have town halls where you invite persons from. You can invite elected officials to talk about issues and how they impact your congregations. You can have town halls where people are talking about uncomfortable issues, and you're inviting Republicans and Democrats and Independents and Green Party and those. Invite them and have those conversations. I think faith-based organizations could do a wonderful service to the community by serving as the places where we can receive this type of information, right? And providing a place for people to come and talk about these uncomfortable issues. And I've had James Cone's Black Liberation Theology, right? In 1969, he wrote the book Black Power, Black Theology and Black Power, and then became known as the father of Black Liberation Theology. So again, I don't see much separation between social justice issue and believe and walking this Christian walk. And certainly because again, if Jesus came to set the captives free,
yes,
so he did, then that means free from this bondage, and certainly free from discrimination.
That's so great. Thank you. So let me, amen. Can we get an amen? That was really good and very helpful. So, but let me ask a question. And David, let me direct it to you. So we've got redlining, we've got redistricting, we've got gerrymandering, we've got systemic racism from the foundation. We've got, as you've written with Reverend Jesse Jackson in Time Magazine, that the Electoral College has overruled the will of the people in 2 of the last 5 presidential elections. Given all of that, does our vote matter? Does it matter? David, what does it matter?
Absolutely, our vote matters. It simply counts in different ways, oftentimes based on where you live, but our voice absolutely 100% matters. This is the fight of our time. This is not the fight of some other time. We are still living in this moment in which these issues, they have not been settled. If we think that voter suppression has to do with the 1960s or the 1860s or the founding of this country, these issues are still very much present in our day-to-day life right now, and they are affecting people in this country right now. In the book, I went down to Alabama and worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center as they were trying. Moral turpitude, as I mentioned earlier, in Alabama had been in play from the late 1880s or so. The passage of the new state constitution in Alabama all the way through 2016, when the state legislature, under threat of litigation, finds a narrow way of eliminating it. They simply don't do anything to inform the nearly 80,000 people in Alabama who were given their voting rights back, that they had been reinstated. They refused to even come up and produce the forms, let alone to do a voter education plan. So a number of groups in Alabama decided that they were going to take this work upon themselves and try to go door to door and actually find the affected people and re-register them. And I joined them, one morning in Birmingham at a bus station, 5:36 in the morning on a hot August day. And we're going up to people, trying to educate them about the changes in the law that could give them or someone they know their right to vote back. And we met a young woman in her late 30s who tried to wave us away at first. And then she says, well, wait a second, no, I can't vote because I have a felony conviction. It turns out she had been arrested as a 17-year-old for smoking marijuana for a minor drug possession charge at the age of 17. And her voting rights were gone before she'd ever had the chance to use them. This is not
just.
It's not just, but this is now. This is America 2020. And we were able to re-register her on the spot. But I want us to remember that these are the voices we are trying to be fighting for. We have got to be fighting for all of these voices today, just as fiercely as we ever have. This is an active and intentional effort that is ongoing to make it much more difficult for some people in some states to vote. And I think we know it disproportionately affects young people and Black people and people of color and other minority groups. And we have got to recognize that this is taking place in our nation right now. And we have to decide the kind of country that we want to live in and step up and fight for the kind of country we want to live in, whether this is okay or not, because it is happening right now on all of our watches.
That is extremely potent. We don't have much time left. We've all been listening with rapt attention. Let's hear from some of our invited guests today. If you have a question, please put that in the chat window so that we can have the panelists address what questions you have. They've given us tremendous insight into the history of how we've arrived here, the challenges that we're up against. As faith leaders, what is it you want to know? What will empower you in your various settings? Those questions can go right into the chat window so that we can address them. So while we're receiving questions, I'm just aware of how we're moving towards pluralism, ethnic pluralism, and it's not going to be a white majority, a striking majority over persons of color. We're going to have Black, brown together, Asian, etc., majority. And by growth of the population, will we overcome this? There's a question to think about. Well, we've got another question coming in. We see the challenges toward empowering people to vote at this time. How can we find out what to do after the election? Because regardless of how this election comes out, there's still going to be work to be done.
Oh, absolutely. This work does not end. Let me say this. We've got to vote in 26 days, but we have to vote up and down the ballot. This is a really important year because this is, again, a census year. This is a redistricting year. And the state legislatures that are elected in most of our states this year are the ones who are going to be drawing the district lines that will determine the playing field for our politics, our congressional delegations, and our state legislatures for the next decade. The lines that were drawn back in 2010 have endured throughout this entire year. They were predominantly drawn by Republicans who had a strategy to capture state legislatures, and it worked. And they've entrenched themselves in power in all of those states. They will still have a leg up heading into 2020, and whoever controls those legislatures will be able to control the process in those states. It is extraordinarily important. So as we as we think about this election, there's a lot more than just a White House at stake. Where these lines get drawn determine an awful lot. 2012, Democratic candidates for the US House win 1.4 million more votes nationwide. For the US House, Republicans control the chamber 234-201. That is in part because of the way that those districts were drawn. Republicans were able to win 13 of 18 seats from Pennsylvania that year, 12 of 16 from Ohio, 10 of 13 in North Carolina, 9 of 14 in Michigan, even when they won fewer votes in most of those states, or when it was 50-50. And in 2018, in Wisconsin, for example, voters elected Democratic US Senator, defeat Scott Walker, the Republican governor. They give Democratic candidates up and down. Statewide candidates win all of those contests, Secretary of State, Treasurer, all of those, Attorney General. And Assembly candidates won 200,000 more votes. And yet, because of the way that those districts were drawn, all that did was cut the Republican advantage in the Assembly to 63-36. So 45% of the vote in Wisconsin adds up to 63.5% of the seats. This is a dangerous period of minority rule. We think that these kinds of things can't happen here. They are happening here right now.
May I add,
Please.
in regards to what everything David is saying is absolutely correct. And I certainly agree with him. And I just want to add that what we can do after the election, as I said before, being very vigilant and then educating ourselves about the process. We're all getting a civics lesson. We've been getting civics lessons for the last 4 years. How government works, what are the powers of the president, powers of the Congress, powers of the United States Senate. And I think we have to continue those lessons and making sure that we understand how it works on the state level and the local level, certainly as well as the federal level. And that we not only vote for these down ballot elections, but we know who, judges are so important. These judges elections and first of all, that we filled out our census forms. We still have until the end of October to do that. So that's certainly one of the things that you can do every Sunday, whether you're meeting in person or remotely, is the first thing on the announcements. Make sure you completed your census forms. You have until October 31st to return them. Every family in this congregation needs to complete those forms. But and just being aware of, so after the election, certainly, regardless of who wins, though, that's when the work begins. Because we need to have a representative democracy. We need folk who are actually representing the ideals and values that we have. And that we're sending them to these legislatures to speak on our behalf, right? Because our vote is our voice, and we're voting so that these people can express what it is that express our concerns and certainly move legislation that will address these issues. So, once these elections occur, that we still have to make sure that we're educating ourselves on certainly not only on the process of voting, but also what legislation is being passed that impact us in regards to impact the ability to vote, impact issues and concerns that you have as a congregation, as individuals, and making sure that we're sharing that information. And also partnering with organizations like Fair Vote, like Advancement Project, like DEMOS, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and other organizations that are working on these issues that you care about, supporting those organizations, and then participate.
Yeah.
Making sure that there's a dearth of poll workers, and folk can. And there's some places where people can still sign up to become poll workers, and making sure that you're, I think Eldridge Cleaver said, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And we can just all continue to work and make sure that we're part of the solution.
Very good. Thank you. We're just a few minutes from close, but I want to note a couple of things. One of our guests here has said it's important to remember that the evangelical Christian Republicans started in the 70s to run for boards of ed, town councils, to get experience and exposure that gave them credibility to run for higher offices, take control of legislatures, and then Congress. They had the long view. We must too. And we have to participate and talk to those running for office right now. I've got a question. I think this is sort of on everybody's mind. So just a minute each for our two esteemed panelists. How can we prevent the November election and post-election from turning into chaos? 1 minute. Gilda?
Pray. It's, I mean, and present it, because there's a lot that you can't control. What Donald Trump is going to say, or anyone else, but it's in regards to it turning into chaos. So that's why I think being educated about the process and knowing that you may not, with all these vote by mail applications, and these has grown exponentially, that we may not know who the president is on November 3rd. It may be election week, not election day. And so, exercising patience. So I would say prayer and patience in my
prayer and patience
is how we can deal with the
prayer, patience, and preparation in the way that you've indicated. David, what's your last minute word for us on that?
Before this crowd, let me say this. Election administrators have a special prayer, and their prayer goes something like this: Dear Lord, please do not let this election be close. Because it's a close election that allows for all kinds of chicanery and legal tests and recounts and fights. An election that is not close takes a lot of that mystery and possibility and fear of chaos away. So I would say that no matter which side you are on, let us pray that the election is not close.
It's not close. This has been an extraordinary hour with the two of you. I am so very grateful to both of you. David Daly, Gilda Daniels, thank you so much for being with us. And I can say we have fulfilled our mission, uncomfortable, but that's what we're here for. We're here to dismantle comfort that is not helpful. We are here to expose ourselves in new ways to bigger ideas, to uncover systemic racism, to expand our own hearts and minds and our capacities to lead in these very challenging and yet very, very potent times, because this is when change can happen as we grow in increasing knowledge, as we grow in increasing skill. And thank you so much. Put your contact information, Gilda and David, in the chat window so people can be in touch with you, the name of your book. Thank you to each and every one of our guests that are here today. I pray that you heard something powerful that will stick with you, that you're going to be able to take back to your congregations, your denominations, your boards, your committees, your people, your families, so that we really can be empowered through the faith of Jesus, through the power of the Holy Spirit, armed with knowledge and with guts to do what we are called to do as people of faith. So thank you so much to each and every one of you. Let us pray. Let us be patient. Let us be involved and participate so that things are clear and we move forward in a positive way. Thank you all so much for being here. We look forward to the next time. We'll be together after the election with a session called Now What? What's next? Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Take care.